Should I stand?
Yeah, whatever, sure, wherever you want.
Oh, thanks, Pete. It's really great to see you guys this morning. Sort of think hard and deliberate about how you might implement interleaving in your classrooms. So the concepts I'll be talking about today in this presentation will not be completely new, right? Because you've heard Patrick and Nicole sort of talk about them already this morning. But hopefully with this presentation, they'll have a little bit more of sort of the scientific sort of evidence, the evidence base. And hopefully, again, this presentation will give you a clearer idea of how these learning strategies might actually benefit learning in your students. So this presentation will focus or revolve around three broad questions. Right, the first one is, are tests only useful for measuring learning? Are they sort of a tool for assessment? Or might they also have another purpose, perhaps promote learning? And that's related to the testing effect, and I'll talk about what that is in a moment. The second broad question deals with when one should engage in practice. We know practice is important, right? If you only learn something once and you never have any further exposure, you never have any practice with that thing, we know we're not going to retain, we're not going to be good at that thing, right? So practice is a part of life, right? If we're going to do something, learn something well, we need to practice. Practice makes perfect. But the question is, when should we engage in practice? When should you review the information that you're really trying to learn well? Should you try to review immediately or soon after you first encounter the material, or might you benefit from waiting a while and then review? And that's related to the spacing effect, and again, of course, I'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to that section. And then the final part of this presentation will focus on practice. When we engage in practice, how should we sequence items during practice? Right? Should we try to group all the same kinds of items together and then practice them back to back? Or might there be some benefit from intermixing different kinds of items together? And this is, of course, related to interleaving. Okay? And of course, I'll wrap it all up with some general conclusions. Okay, so let's start first with tests. As I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with, given that you're teachers here in America, right? Testing perhaps doesn't quite have the best reputation, especially in this country, right? So you can see from this picture here, this boy is holding up a sign and it says, "Testing is not teaching." Right? So when you use the word testing in America, it's almost like sort of a bad word, right? At least in educational circles. It doesn't have the best reputation, right? But bear in mind, I'm not talking about that kind of test, right? The boys probably protesting standardized testing, right? Which is now quite prevalent in the classroom and stuff like that. And I'm not talking about those kinds of tests. If you ask the average layperson, the average educator, right, what's the purpose of tests, quizzes, exams? Why do teachers, spend time and effort and resources to administer tests in the classroom? Almost invariably, the answer you're going to get is, well, of course, teachers have to do that every now and then because they have to assess how well their students have mastered the content, right, or the material, whatever they're trying to learn. Right, so traditionally, and even today, almost exclusively, tests are viewed as tools for assessment. But what's interesting is that a long history, over 100 years of research in human memory has revealed that testing doesn't just merely measure the contents of memory. That when you test someone, right, they have to try to generate the answer, right? Typically, the test entails that taking that test, that attempting to answer the test question, can actually serve as a very powerful learning opportunity for the student, right? That the memory for the information that's tested gets enhanced to a greater extent than just additional exposure or re-exposure to that material, like rereading the textbook again. Right? And that phenomenon is now referred to as the testing effect. And sometimes in the literature, we also refer to it as the benefit of retrieval practice. And it will become clear why we call it retrieval practice in a moment. As I mentioned, there's a very long history of research in human memory that has revealed this effect, this phenomenon. And actually, the first published empirical study that we know of that demonstrated this effect was published in 1909, so really over 100 years ago. This is not a new phenomenon by any means. But even before empirical evidence was available, so even before sort of the scientific method was well known and so on, and became in vogue, right? If you look at the writings of William James. William James is regarded as the father of psychology here in this country, right? So in the 19th century, he wrote his famous book, The Principles of Psychology, that sort of helped split psychology apart from philosophy, right? Established psychology as an independent sort of field, and then it eventually became an empirical science. And so William James, this is before empirical scientific evidence was available. He was a very wise man, and he had all these intuitions and observations about the human mind. And so let's take a look at an excerpt from his book. He says, a curious peculiarity of our memory is that the things are impressed better by active than by passive repetition. And I mean that in learning by heart, for example, when we almost know the piece, it pays better to wait and recollect by an effort from within than to look at the book again. If we recover the words in the former way, we shall probably know them the next time round. If in the latter way, we shall very likely need the book once more. So what's he saying here? If you're trying to learn something really well, it's a good strategy, right? To wait and try to recollect from within. Recollect is try to recall, try to generate the information from within, rather than just keep looking at the book again and again and again, right? So he's really talking about this notion of testing yourself. It's going to be beneficial to your learning. And a few hundred years before William James, right, Sir Francis Bacon sort of said something quite similar. Right? He said, if you read a piece of text through 20 times, you will not learn it by heart so easily as if you read it 10 times while attempting to recite from time to time and consulting the text when your memory fails. Right? So recite here again is recite from memory. Right? Trying to recite a poem from memory, that kind of idea. Right? So again, the same thing. Right? Instead of just looking at the text again and again and again, why not put it aside, try to recite it from memory, and then of course if you fail, give yourself feedback, then look at the text. Right? So testing with feedback, being good for your learning. And quite impressive even, several, hundreds, even 1,000 years before that, right? Aristotle basically also said the same thing, right? He said, exercise in repeatedly recalling a thing strengthens the memory. So we've got over 100 years of empirical evidence, scientific evidence, and then even before that, based on intuitions and observations from philosophers, but this is not a new idea, right? That testing can be a very powerful means for learning. But if you look at the title of these two papers, right, published fairly recently in the late 80s and early 90s, right, these are published in educational psychology journals, right? So the first one is, you see from the title, this educational psychologist named his paper, The Testing Phenomenon, Not Gone, But Nearly Forgotten. He's basically saying this testing effect, right? We know about it, it's not gone, we know about it, but it's nearly forgotten. So what he's saying if you look at educational practice, right, what teachers do in the classroom, are we really harnessing the potential of this testing effect? And he's saying, no, not really, it's sort of forgotten, it's not really being applied. And in that same vein, right, a few years later, another educational psychologist published a very similar paper, right, you see from the title, it says, Using Tests to Promote Learning, a Neglected Classroom Resource. Right, so again, a very similar lament. Right? We know there's this tool that could be quite useful in the classroom, but you don't quite see educators make use of it. So kind of sad state of affairs. And I would say, thankfully, within the last decade, slightly over a decade and a half maybe, there has been a great resurgence of interest in this testing effect. Right? And in part, this is due to a growing realization amongst policymakers that educational practice needs to be rooted in an empirical base. Right? There needs to be scientific evidence that informs what teachers do in the classroom. For too long, right, educational practice is sort of more driven by maybe educational philosophy or ideology and stuff like that. But we now know the scientific method is able to actually produce useful knowledge for us. So why not, rely on scientific evidence? So thankfully, all those kinds of reasons have led to increased research on these topics, and I'm going to be telling you about some of this research today. So in the first study I'm going to be discussing, we tried to address a theoretical question, right? So we've talked about how testing might be a very powerful tool for learning, and you might be curious as to, well, how does it work then? Why is it that testing has this kind of property to it? Right? How does it work? And here on the screen are sort of three plausible explanations, right? The first one says, well, maybe when you test a student, right, in essence, you're giving them this additional focused presentation of the target fact or the target sort of concept that you want them to learn, right? So maybe it's just that additional presentation, very focused presentation of the target information. And that's why they're very good at that little bit of information later on. That's certainly plausible, not a very interesting explanation, but nonetheless a very plausible one. Right? So that's potentially one explanation. The second one says, well, when you test someone, when you test a student, right, in order to answer those test questions, they have to engage in certain mental operations, certain mental processes, right, to answer a test question. And those happen to also be the same kinds of mental operations and processes that the student needs to engage in later on when they're called upon to use that same information again. Right? So you practice certain mental operations at time point 1, and then you have to call upon those same mental operations at time point 2. Not surprisingly, you get some kind of benefit. Right? It's just like practicing a skill. Right? So that's also another plausible explanation. Right? So number 2. And then the third one says, well, maybe it's the act of retrieval. Right? That when you take a test, not all tests, but in many cases, many instances, when a student is confronted with a test question, right, it's a closed book test, right, they often have to search their knowledge banks, right, search what's in their memory, and then figure out what's the relevant information, and then they have to try to pull it out, right, retrieve it. And so according to this explanation, it's this act of retrieval itself that is producing the benefit, right? It modifies the memory trace. That when we retrieve something from memory, we're really changing our memory. Right? It modifies the memory trace. And so the corollary of this explanation is that if you make the retrieval demands more effortful during that initial test, you can actually enhance learning or retention even more. Right? So 3 plausible explanations. Let me describe to you the first study that tried to sort of tease these apart. The first study was also designed to address a practical question. Right? If I'm going to tell teachers, oh, please try to use testing in your classrooms and your assignments more frequently, more regularly, a common question that I might get is, well, does it matter what test format we use, or are all kinds of tests equivalent? Do we have to care about how we format the questions? Right? So this study was also designed to answer sort of a practical question. Does test format matter? So in this study, we manipulated, right, we varied the initial test type. Right, so we use 2 different formats that are very commonly used in education. We use short answer questions. We had multiple choice questions. So they're all testing the exact same facts or concepts, right? Just the formatting was different, right? Multiple choice, there were options given. You can pick the correct option. Short answer is just a question frame. The student has to generate the answer. And then we also had this stringent control condition that we call the read fact or read statements condition, in which we just gave the answer to the student, and they didn't have to generate anything, right? They weren't tested, they were just given the answer, a statement that was basically the answer to the question. On the final test, right, they were tested later to see how well they had retained the information they had learned. We also varied the test format, short answer, and multiple choice. And I should mention in this experiment, we provided corrective feedback, right? So that means during the initial quiz, short answer and multiple choice, after answering each test question, they were given the correct answer. So now if you think back to the 3 potential theoretical explanations earlier on as to why testing produces its advantage, we can come up with potentially different predictions of what final test performance should look like. Right? So there's actually some competing predictions. If testing is producing its benefit merely because it gives the student re-exposure to the target fact or target information, if that's the case, then in all these 3 conditions, whether it's a short answer format, multiple choice format, or you get the answer without having to take the test, in all cases, they're getting repeated exposure to the target fact or target concept. Right? So if that's the case, if that's what's driving the benefit, there really should not be any difference in final test performance across these 3 conditions. Correct? Does that make sense? So that's one prediction. If it's just repeated exposure, in all these 3 conditions, they're getting repeated exposure. So final test performance should be the same for all those 3. Another possible prediction, this is the one that talks about the mental operations or processes that we engage in when we take a test. Right? According to this explanation, test format would matter. If your final test is a multiple choice format, then having had that initial multiple choice should yield a greater benefit than if you had taken an initial short answer. Right? And conversely, if your final test format is short answer, then having had an initial short answer quiz would produce a greater benefit than having had an initial multiple choice, right? So test format would matter in this case, right? According to this explanation. And then finally, if it's something to do with retrieval, right? That during the initial tests, when you're being quizzed, you have to retrieve the target information from memory, and that's what's driving the benefit of that testing. And this would be the prediction, right? That if it's more effortful during that initial quiz, more demanding, you have to, query memory, and it's more effortful to pull out the correct information, then test format would matter. It's the initial test format that matters, right? So again, if you think of a multiple choice quiz and a short answer quiz, in most instances, there can be exceptions, but in most cases, multiple choice, no options are given to the student. They just have to pick one out of 4 or 5, right? That, in most instances, entails less effortful retrieval than if you just had the question frame and then the student just has to generate. This is a blank box and they have to generate the answer, right? So in that case here, the prediction is taking that initial short answer quiz that would yield a greater benefit overall, right? So different kinds of predictions based on potential explanations for what's driving this effect. So let me describe to you the procedure for this study. So if you were a subject, a participant in this study, you would come to the lab. These are all college students, right? They would be given 4 short journal articles to read. They're very brief, 4-page long journal articles. You can take about 15 minutes to read each one. That'd be more than sufficient. So that's what we gave them, 15 minutes to read each article at a very leisurely pace. And then after reading each article, right, we quiz them, right? So for example, after reading the first article, they might get a multiple choice quiz on the content of that article, and they were given feedback, as I mentioned. After reading the second article, they might get a short answer quiz, and again given feedback. After reading the third article, they would get the read facts condition, right? Just given the answers to test questions without having to take a test. And then after reading the fourth article, for example, if that's the control filler condition, then they would just get a demographic questionnaire after reading the article, right? So no further reminders of the article, just fill out some demographic questionnaire. Right, so every participant went through all 4 conditions, right? Because they read 4 articles and each one was paired with one of these conditions. Feedback was provided, and then 3 days later, right, we asked our participants to come back, and then we tested them on all these 4, the content of all these 4 articles again. And there were 2 formats for the final test, multiple choice and short answer. So let's take a look at the results on this final test 3 days later. Final multiple choice, let's take a look at that on the left first. Right, so this none condition is just a filler questionnaire, right? They did a demographic questionnaire after reading, so no further exposure after reading. Performance was 69%, not very good. Right? If they were given the answers to the test questions, but didn't actually have to take the test, not surprisingly, performance went up. Right? Being given the answers before having to take the test. Right? If they'd taken a prior multiple choice quiz, performance went up a little bit more. It's hard to see, but it's 87%. What we found was it's taking that initial short answer quiz that yielded the greatest benefit, right? In red, the tallest bar is the red bar. Now let's take a look at the final short answer performance on the right. Again, if no further exposure after reading the passage, not surprisingly, performance is pretty crummy 3 days later. If they've been given the test answers without having to take the test, performance went up a little bit, quite a bit actually, right? If they've taken the prior multiple choice quiz on that, on the content of that passage, performance went up a little bit more, 53%. But what we find is, again, it's taking that initial short answer quiz and actually yielded the greatest benefit, right, both from final multiple choice as well as for final short answer questions. Right, so what we can conclude from these data, these results, is that yes, we find a testing effect, right? Testing does actually benefit the student's memory of the content for the passage that they read 3 days earlier. But test format does matter, right? The enhancement is greater when the test format sort of entails more effortful retrieval. In this case, it's the short answer test format. So based on the competing predictions, right, I laid out earlier on, our data seem to support this idea that more effortful retrieval is a good thing, right? It's something to do with retrieval. Another practical question that we were interested in answering was whether feedback matters. So again, very important thing, right? In the classroom, do you need to spend time going through the test answers in class, right? Again, time is a finite resource, right? Or can you just dispense with feedback? Well, maybe it's not useful. You don't have to spend 10 minutes going through the answers, right? Does feedback matter? So we ran the exact same experiment, except that we dispensed with feedback. We did not provide feedback during that initial quiz. So they would answer the test questions, they weren't told whether they were correct, they weren't told what the correct answer was, that kind of stuff. Right, so now let's take a look at their final performance 3 days later. Right, so if you look at this graph and try to think back to the graph you saw earlier on, right, a couple of slides ago, right, there's one big difference now. Right, the red bars are no longer the tallest bars. Right? Hope all of you detected that. Right, so that's sort of the main difference here. So what's going on here? Why is it that the initial short answer quiz format is now no longer producing the greatest benefit to this final performance later on? What I didn't mention to you was that if you look at initial test performance, so this is immediately after reading the passage, initial test performance in the short answer quiz format was only about 50%. So only about half the time the participants were able to generate the correct answer for those questions that they were confronted with. Right? So imagine if you don't provide feedback, which is exactly what we did do in this experiment. We did not provide feedback. There's no way for the students to correct their errors, right? If they don't know something and you don't tell them how they're wrong or what's the correct answer, that's a missed learning opportunity, right? So of course they're not going to magically figure out the right answer on their own if you never tell them the correct answer, right? So what these results tell us is corrective feedback is important. Even if it takes a little bit of resources, time, to go through the answers, and that's important, especially when the initial test performance is not high, right? So if you want students to benefit from that initial test, from the testing effect, if performance is not high, you need to make sure that corrective feedback is provided so that they do have this learning opportunity. So what I've described so far is, so lab experiments kind of artificial, the questions are repeated, so what they were given on the quiz was also the same kind of question they were given, on the final test 3 days later and stuff like that. And we know that's not how teachers would want to design tests and quizzes in the classroom, right? So the lab experiment was to sort of answer also a theoretical question, so it was a bit artificial. But I should point out that many studies have also attempted to generalize these kinds of findings into sort of actual classrooms, and so I'm going to show you a couple of examples. Right, so this one here has to do with middle school science, right? And they implemented quizzing within an actual classroom, and what they found, if you can see from the title, is successful transfer performance, right? So transfer here means benefit to performance on different kinds of questions. That's why it's called transfer, right? It's when we can apply the knowledge to a novel context, that's considered transfer. So let me give you a better idea of what they did here in this study in the middle school in Illinois. And this is in middle school science, so they're covering ecology, the topic of ecology, and so these are the kinds of questions they used, right? So they had two classes of questions. One they call term response questions. So these are more like definitional kinds of questions, right? So more like just remembering a definition of a word. And so even for these kinds of questions, right, there were always alternate forms. So no question was repeated on the quiz and on the final test, right? They could always switch to an alternate form. So it's never a verbatim repetition. So for example, right, term response, right? What is the struggle between organisms to survive in a habitat with limited resources, right? That's testing the concept of competition, right? Answer D. But that's also the same answer to this question that says, what is the term for when two or more organisms vie for limited environmental resources? Right? So again, alternate forms for question, testing the same concept. At the same time, that same concept, competition, can also appear in an application style question. Right? So the application style questions didn't focus so much on like the definition of the word competition, but rather provided some kind of scenario, as you can see from these examples here with raccoons and foxes and stuff like that, right? But nonetheless, still tap the identical concept of competition, right? So there are two classes of questions, and even within each class, there were alternate forms. So no questions were repeated at time point 1 and then at time point 2. So this is performance on the final unit exam, or the final test. Right, so there are two kinds of questions, term response as well as application. And then these different bars here just indicate whether they were quizzed in a term response style, quizzed in the application style, or on the white bars, not quizzed. Right, so if you look at the final, the exam performance, right, one trend is pretty obvious, is that being quizzed is helpful, right? So if you look at the white bars, they're generally the lowest bars, right? So if you're not quizzed, performance is poorest on those kinds of questions on the exam, right? But if it's a term response final exam question, right, having been quizzed earlier on in term response style, right, led to the highest performance. But even being quizzed in the application style also, produced some benefit, right? This gray bar here is still taller than this white bar. And then if you look at the application style questions on the exam, the greatest benefit comes from being quizzed in an application style question earlier on. Right? Overall, again, these results tell us that quizzing in the context of middle school science classroom, right, can be very beneficial for the students' learning. And again, this does not entail repetition of questions, not asking identical questions on the quiz as on the exam and stuff like that. So that's an important result for us to look at. And this one is another sort of a classroom kind of study, but this one's done with elementary students, much younger students here. If any of you have like young kids, you might have heard of rainbow writing. No, you've heard of it? Right? So it's apparently a strategy used in elementary school for young kids to help them learn spelling of new words, right? Because they have to learn new words. A young kid has a small vocabulary, they're being taught new words all the time. And so they're trying to learn how to spell, and apparently the strategy says if you make it like a coloring book kind of thing, you color each letter a different color, it's going to help the child learn, right? Because it's fun, whatever, each letter is a different color, it's very striking for them to look at, whatever, right? So that's sort of the rationale of rainbow writing. Each letter is written in a different color, and that's where the word rainbow comes from. And so that's used, there are worksheets, there are workbooks that use this strategy at the younger ages. But the question is that really a beneficial use of the child's time, right? If you want to help them learn spelling, let's say, of new words, maybe there's a better strategy, right? We know retrieval practice is good for a lot of different kinds of learning, so maybe we can compare, right? So indeed, this is what this study did, right? In an elementary school classroom, they compared the students' learning of a bunch of new words, right, with retrieval practice, right, so testing with feedback, right, versus using rainbow writing. And as you can see from the results here in this graph, right, whether you test them, give them the final test a day later or 5 weeks later, right, it's clear that the words that they learn using retrieval practice, there's better performance. They're better able to spell those new words compared to the ones that they didn't wrote in different colors or whatever, right? So clearly, retrieval practice is superior to rainbow writing if you're trying to learn to spell new words. And then finally, the final study I'm going to talk about, this one's done with college students at Harvard, right? And they were interested in how having interpolated tests, brief small tests, regularly throughout the learning process might actually be beneficial. Beneficial in what ways? Well, beneficial in terms of keeping students more focused on their learning, and of course ultimately improving their learning. Right, so let me describe to you the procedure in this study. Right, so this was done with online video lectures. Right, that's becoming more and more common. Right, in fact, even at the lower levels, we talk about flipped classrooms. Students are supposed to watch videos at home, and so they looked at videos, right, video lectures on statistics. Right, these are college students, and so they have these short segments of maybe 8 to 10 minutes of someone standing in front talking about some statistical concept. Right, so let me describe to you different conditions. Right, so in the tested group, they watch the first segment of the video on statistics. They'll do a bit of math to help them forget about what they just watched. Right, just a brief bout of math, arithmetic problems, and then they were given a test on that video segment that they had just watched. Then they move on to watch the next segment, do a little bit of math, and then get tested on video segment 2, the most recent segment. And they watch the third segment, do a little bit of math, and then test on that third segment, and so on, and then the fourth segment. In the restudy condition, right, they again watch the video segment, do a bit more of math, but instead of being tested on that video segment they had just watched, they were basically given like a summary sheet of these are the main points, of the lecture that you just watched. Right? Then they move on to watch the next video segment, do a bit of math, and then get again some summary points to read, and watch the third one, and so on and so forth. They also had a non-tested condition, right, where they just watched the video segments, did some math, did some more math, arithmetic problems, watched the video segment, did more math, and so on and so forth. The important thing is, across these 3 different conditions, 3 different groups, all groups were tested after the 4th segment. Right, so you can see in red here, all groups received a test on segment 4. the fourth segment, fourth video that they watch. Another interesting point, they also inserted what they call mind-wandering probes. Right? So these are online lectures, right? So they're watching it on a computer. At random times during the, think of like a YouTube clip, right? A window would pop up on the screen that would ask the participant, the learner, are you mind-wandering now? And they just have to click yes or no.
I love that.
Right? So yes just means I'm not thinking about the lecture right now, right? And of course no means I'm still focused on the lecture. Right, so there are random times, so it's unpredictable. It's not just a student know, oh yeah, in 5 seconds it's going to ask you whether I'm mind-wandering, so I should start focusing now. Right? So let's take a look at the results. Let's look at mind-wandering first. Right? So T is the tested condition, RS is restudy, get some summary points to restudy, and NT is the no-test group. Right? So in terms of proportion of mind-wandering, when these random probes came up, how often the students would say, yes, I'm mind-wandering versus no, I'm not mind-wandering. We see, right, the proportion of mind-wandering was reduced in the group that got these regular tests. After each segment, they were getting a test, right? Their mind-wandering tended to be less frequent when they were watching these video segments. What I did mention too was when they were watching the video segments, the researchers gave the participants like PowerPoint slides, like outlines of PowerPoints, right? Just as you might have if you were a student in a class. Sometimes the instructor might give you an outline before the lecture, and so the students were told, just treat this like you're attending a regular lecture. Here's the outline of the lecture. Feel free to annotate the slides, put extra notes in, elaborations, whatever you want. Right? Just imagining this is a regular class you're attending. At the end of the experiment, they collected back, the researchers collected back, the notes, and they then counted, how often did the students actually annotate, right onto the slides? And what they found was, again, it's in the tested group, the group that got tested after each segment, that there was a higher proportion of students actually jotting things down. Yes, question?
Did the participants know whether they're going to be tested getting the notes or whether they're going to be doing part of like, did they know that they're going to be getting a test at the end of it, and the other groups knew that they were?
Good point. So they deliberately kept it vague. So what they were told was, after each segment, you may get tested, right? They were just told that may. And of course, in the test group, they were tested at the end of each segment, right? Yes.
I'd be curious to see if, you said there were 4 segments, did the amount of note-taking significantly increase for the tested group because they got tested and they knew that it was coming most likely to number 2, 3, 4?
They didn't do that comparison as to are the notes from segment 1 different from segment 2? No, they did not do that. So that's just like an average across the three. But I imagine it probably, especially after the first one where they did get tested and they realized, oh wait, I really need to learn this stuff well.
You're paying attention,
Correct.
You're mind wandering if you know now.
Correct, exactly. So I imagine there probably would be some kind of different trend across the 4 segments, right? But no, they didn't analyze it that way. They just looked at it collapse as an average across all the segments. But this is the part that's also interesting to look at. After the 4th segment, all participants were tested, right? All groups received that same test on segment 4. And as you can see, it's the test group, the T, right, that scored the highest. And of course, that's probably not surprising, right? They are doing less mind wandering, they're taking more notes, it's indicatively more engaged in their learning. So of course, we would expect that they would also perform better on that final segment when we were tested. Right? So, but bottom line, these results tell us that having these small regular tests can also serve a useful purpose, right? Especially if we have sort of a long video to watch. People might, we're all human, right? Our attention can wander or fluctuate, and so sort of having these interpolated tests can be a useful way, potentially, right, of sort of keeping students more focused.